Next speaker is Paul Griffin. Paul's an academic clinician from Queensland, but he's better known for speaking on Redneck Radio regularly and really informing the whole population on a number of respiratory viral topics. So Paul, thank you for speaking. Paul's going to speak on the very latest in influenza prevention. Thank you.
So thanks, Lou, and to the organisers for the invitation to speak. I'm a bit hard to understand tonight. It's hard to talk between all the shivering. Just got off the plane from Queensland. It's very different weather down here. And I always find these talks are a bit more nerve-wracking than most. I have a few talks lately, but it's difficult to do so in such a room full of such genuine experts. So if I stuff anything up, please be kind. So green button, supposed to be easy. Apparently, here we go. A few disclosures. I've done a lot of clinical trials with a lot of the things I'm going to speak about tonight. Of course, it's hard to summarise everything when we look at flu prevention. So some of these have been picked because I've had a role in the clinical trials or other involvement, but also some other things that I thought might be relevant. So here's the background, but we'll get straight into it. Don't have to tell this audience the impact of influenza. So, obviously it's still huge despite having a reprieve perhaps for a couple of years, but it's clear we do need to do more to intervene. And we know that there's some challenges with controlling influenza, and we do have vaccines that obviously make a tremendous difference. But if I draw your attention straight to that bottom point there, does remain our best defence, but there are some limitations with the strategy we have at the moment. We obviously need to match those circulating subtypes, and we just had a great talk looking at what's happening, bottlenecking, etc. But it is a bit of a challenge to do that every year. A long lead time potentially in a pandemic situation with the platforms that we're using at the moment. We've got an issue with egg adaptation. I'll talk briefly about that. Limited ability to protect those not able to respond to vaccination. That's somewhere we've made some inroads with COVID. So hopefully that'll also be the same with flu at times. And we've got a relatively low efficacy from the vaccine. And I think this is going to be a challenge as people want to know more about vaccines, both efficacy and adverse events. When we present them figures like this showing what the VE has been for our flu vaccine, I think it's going to lead to some challenging discussions. And so, of course, it remains our best defence, but it would be nice if we could do a little bit better. So I thought I'd start with non-pharmaceutical interventions, and we've seen some figures already. And if you look at what happened, you can see there, and these may not project well, but from April 2020 to May 2022, it was very clear we had very few cases. So something we were doing was able to reduce the burden of influenza in our community. We had 752 cases recorded in 2021. And I'm not going to start any fights here about the impact of each of these or what the best is, for example, but it's clear that our non-pharmaceutical interventions that were applied to control the COVID-19 pandemic were effective at limiting the spread of influenza. And how much of these individually had an impact, it's not clear, but it looks like that there are some at least that could have a potential impact. And so I guess in one sense that could give us hope that we might be able to apply these to a bad flu season or another pandemic, although it is clear there are some challenges already in place in terms of resistance to some of these. So maybe not too optimistic about the impact of that at the moment. Antivirals. And while obviously we're all familiar with using antivirals for treatment, there are actually a lot of studies and approvals for a number of these antivirals in the prevention space. So some examples, particularly where they might be of additional use, would be in those people at greatest risk for severe or complicated influenza, or in an effort to control institutional outbreaks. And of course, we keep talking about the impact of COVID in nursing homes, or flu also poses a really big challenge. And there is some good data suggesting that perhaps these antivirals might have a role for controlling the spread of that virus in that setting. And you can see there, each of the antivirals have some pretty promising figures in terms of the reduced risk, 3 versus 17%, for example, with oseltamivir. The others are pretty similar, and baloxavir also has some reasonable data suggesting that it might actually be useful for prevention in household contacts. So something also to consider in addition to our more traditional strategies, I guess. So monoclonal antibodies, and it's clear this has been something that's been highlighted with the successes we've seen with COVID, both for pre-exposure prophylaxis in those not able to be protected by vaccination, but also for treatment. Obviously, about this time last year, we were using sotrovimab like it was going out of fashion, and then more recently, a bit more of a focus on Evusheld, the combined long-acting antibody combination from AstraZeneca, which was used both for treatment and pre-exposure prophylaxis. Some challenges more recently with ongoing immune evasion, but I think the efficacy of those interventions remains clear. And we've had some long-term examples as well, things like Hep B, rabies, for example, some RSV products as well. And there's a lot of activity in this space with influenza, and I've listed, I think, 7 or 8 there that I'll go through very quickly. So VIR 2482, an intramuscular monoclonal antibody, it's actually been demonstrated to have some potential to neutralise all major strains of flu A. And this has some clever engineering, like a lot of other products we've seen with COVID, so an extended half-life. So hopefully that would potentially give protection from the whole season. This was a study I was involved in the phase 1, which we did up in Brisbane. And now the phase 2 has been recruited, 3,000 participants. And so data for that one is expected in the middle of this year. And they have collaborated once again, like they did with Sotrovimab, with GSK to lead the post-phase 2 development and commercialisation of that, of course, if the clinical trials prove that it's successful. And I'll go through these pretty quickly because they're all fairly similar, but more just so that people are aware. Genentech have an antibody clone from a single human plasmablast from a vaccinated donor, binding some conserved epitopes. So again, thought to be able to neutralise a very large number of strains, so all known human influenza strains. Safe and effective safe and well tolerated in phase 1, but unfortunately the phase 2 didn't show improved clinical outcomes. Vistera, so VIS410, a US biotech, they've got some clever engineering of some antibodies. They've got quite a big pipeline. Also have an envelope protein for dengue. Was shown to broadly neutralise the stem, and animal models look pretty impressive, but clinical trials maybe not quite as impressive. Was safe and effective in a challenge study. And the phase 2 was pretty small, and I was involved in that one, and did have some favourable effects on symptoms and virus replication, but perhaps didn't quite tick all the boxes they were hoping to. Crucell had some collaborations with NIAID as well as Retroscreen, and in both of these, not quite the results they were hoping. Limited efficacy for 6261 in a human challenge study some time ago, and in the phase 2 and the challenge trials for 8020, they did show some benefit, but the residues were prone to antigenic drift, so effectiveness was reduced by some escape mutants, was what they reported there. And Theraclone also have a promising antibody taken from memory B cells of a healthy human subject, and recognised a previously unknown conformational epitope, an ectodomain of the M2E matrix protein, which is highly conserved, and did protect mice with from lethal challenge with a few different flu viruses. Phase 1 looked promising, and the phase 2, also showed that might have some immediate therapeutic benefit in infection with no apparent emergence of resistant virus, but obviously very early days with that one. And Celltrion from South Korea have 2 antibodies binding to the stem part of the hemagglutinin, and effective against a wide number of different flus there. Clinical trials, phase 1 was successful in a press release, so couldn't find anything published on that. The phase 2A in the UK was apparently safe and effective, but limited information about that one, so not really sure how that's progressing. Some diarrhea was seen in one of the clinical trials there. So I know I skipped through that pretty quickly, but a fair bit to chat about with vaccines. And we know that, as I said, the flu vaccine is very important, but there are some limitations. And so I did borrow this slide from a talk I gave for Seqirus. So there are patient factors, so things like immunosenescence. We want to address viral factors, antigenic shift and drift, and maybe a universal vaccine might be a way of overcoming that, as well as egg adaptation. And important to point out, although I won't be talking about that in my talk now, that in the yellow or orange at the bottom, utilisation factors are also something that's got to be strongly considered in terms of improving how our flu vaccines can work. And, this isn't new necessarily, but for completeness, I put that in there. We know that the elderly are at greatest risk, don't respond so well to vaccines, but also at risk of greater complications. And we see obviously what COVID's done in nursing homes. And as I said earlier, flu can do similar. So we've got 2 strategies for addressing that reduced response. We have an adjuvanted vaccine with MF59 and a high dose with 4 times the amount of antigen that should be. And a bit of a generalization, but studies do suggest a relative improvement with those augmented vaccines of around 20 to 25%. So a very important step forward. And in terms of egg adaptation, again, I'm sure this audience is familiar with this concept. So we know that the viruses don't always grow well in eggs, and they can adapt to that environment, causing some changes that mean basically the fit with the circulating strains we're trying to protect people from may not be as good as we would have hoped. And this can contribute to vaccine virus mismatch, which might have an impact on effectiveness in some seasons. And so So one way of addressing that, as we hopefully find some new plates, is flu Cellvax quad. So this is obviously a cell-based vaccine. This is propagated in MDCK cells, so overcomes the prospect for egg adaptation and changes that might reduce the fit, I guess. And this is now indicated for use in adults and children 2 years of age and older, not funded, of course, and has some limited contraindications there. So some reasonable data to suggest that elimination of egg adaptation might have some promising effects in terms of efficacy. So some retrospective studies there. But like a lot of these things, like we've talked about so much with the COVID therapies and other things, there's been no true head-to-head randomized controlled trials to be able to make some of these claims. But if you look at this little chart here, you can see, and I don't know how well it projects, but all those studies basically favoured flu Cellvax potentially over more traditional approaches. So it is likely there is some benefit there, but of course, a number of variables to contribute to how significant that may well be. So in terms of newer platforms, and I use the word new cautiously, with mRNA, for example, we know that that's not, strictly speaking, new technology. That little paper that I put up there was some clinical trial that I was involved in, I think 2015, with an mRNA vaccine. So it's not as new as perhaps people think with how successful they've been with COVID, but it's been really clear that these mRNA vaccines have made a huge difference with COVID. But both of the manufacturers of the two mRNA vaccines we use have had a long pipeline, which has included influenza vaccines for some time. So with BioNTech, obviously collaborating with Pfizer, the phase 3 first participants were dosed in September. So probably getting close to having some results with that one. And Moderna actually have a few different mRNA vaccines, and I know there's some representatives here, so I won't steal their thunder, and forgive me if I don't get this right, but they've got a few different mRNA candidates under various stages of development. So I suspect it won't be too long until we have some of these as an option potentially as well. And again, recombinant protein vaccines are not necessarily new, and we've had a lot of examples around for a long time, Hep B, HPV, and there's actually been a recombinant flu vaccine licensed by the FDA in 2013 in Flublok. And so this is a quadrivalent hemagglutinin recombinant. It is on the ARTG as of the 12th of May, 2021. And some studies, including that little graph there in the top right, have suggested that perhaps it's up to 30% more effective at preventing flu in people 50 years of age and older than traditional approaches. But again, we'll wait and see if we get that one. Novavax, again, there's people in the room who are obviously very familiar with this. And again, while it's come to the fore with COVID, been around for a while, they've got a relatively long pipeline as well. That's including a flu candidate, so-called nanoflu, a quadrivalent nanoparticle hemagglutinin vaccine with their proprietary Matrix M adjuvant, and phase 3 trials are underway for that one. So potentially getting close also. Viral vector, again, this has actually been something that's been used for flu for quite some time. And there's been a whole host of different vectors that have been applied here. And as we saw potentially with COVID, a number of advantages of this approach, including strong humoral and cellular responses may be able to be generated. And this is also a platform that lends itself well to, and I'll talk a bit more specifically about this in a moment, but to the being able to give broader coverage, or a so-called universal vaccine potentially. And Vaxitech, who's a company who's spun out of the University of Oxford, have an MVA vectored vaccine, which is a very common viral vector, as many people would know, with the ability to generate really strong T-cell responses. And they've got a recombinant replication deficient MVA vector expressing antigens both for nuclear protein M1 as a fusion protein. But the phase 2b did fail to achieve the primary endpoint of reduced incidence compared to licensed vaccines. But I'm sure that technology will continue to be developed. A lot of people have been talking about this already, and a lot of people here will be familiar, but the prospect of a combination vaccine, obviously the success of these platforms with COVID lends itself very well, coming up with a combined product. Novavax doing some good work in this space, and just finished recruitment of a study with a number of sites in Australia and New Zealand. I'm sure there are some other investigators here with a lead site on that one. Moderna doing some good work with a few combination vaccines, including COVID and flu, as well as COVID, flu and RSV. So there's some talk about RSV vaccines. So maybe we'll make Djokovic get that one before he comes back. And then Pfizer also are doing some good work in terms of combining some of their vaccines. And they had a phase 1 for one of their combo vaccines commenced late last year. And so I think, what everyone would really like to see is a universal vaccine. And again, this is being talked about a lot for COVID. It's an ambitious goal. But having said that, with all the advances that we've seen recently, maybe it's one that's not necessarily out of reach. And so this little cartoon shows a number of the targets and the 6 different platforms that I guess are most commonly applied. Of course, there are other more novel platforms that I won't get a chance to go through tonight. But we'll list these off. So in terms of genetically modified flu virus space, there's a few here. You can see there that the most advanced, at least in this summary that I found, was still only in phase 2. In terms of recombinant, I don't know how well that projects. So we've got at least 1 in phase 3, 1 in phase 2, and a couple in phase 1. So progressing there. In terms of virus-like particles, there's 1 there in phase 3, a quadrivalent VLP, and 1 in phase 1. And again, this is not necessarily an exhaustive list. So non-VLP nanoparticle based, so Novavax there in phase 3, quite a few. Phase 2, including Ozavax, which are about to start clinical trials in Australia any day as well, and a couple there in phase 1. Viral vectored, again, quite a few there in phase 2, none at least in this list in phase 3. And as I've already mentioned, nucleic acid based, so the mRNA vaccines there in phase 3, and a host of others in phase 1. Oops. And I thought I'd just quickly go through alternate routes of administration as well. So we want to obviously have some new platforms. There's also been a lot of great work. And again, this didn't start necessarily due to COVID. The Vaxis team, which came out of UQ, which some people here or online, I'm sure, do some work with, came up with a great idea of, instead of having one big syringe, they have thousands of micro projections on a tiny patch. And I don't know if you can see in the picture, but it's about a centimetre square. And this, in addition to obviously avoiding the need for needle and syringe, has a number of other benefits. It's stable at room temperature for some time. And there's some talk that these sort of approaches might be able to give a slightly different immune response, with maybe some beneficial effects from giving it into the skin. We started there with a clinical trial using no antigen coating on the patches. That was obviously found to be safe and well tolerated, and so proceeded to do a trial with flu coating on the patches, and that was actually a few years ago. And that seemed to work well as well. So obviously, like a lot of these vaccines, very focused on COVID for a period of time, but I'm sure we'll return to developing their flu candidates fairly soon. Something that I think, again, has already been mentioned, and I guess we'd all like to see, is Flumist. So a live attenuated quadrivalent that's administered intranasally. And it's been interesting to tease out what's happened to that over time. So approved in the US a long time ago. Strongly recommended, I think it's fair to say, in July 2014, particularly in children. Not long thereafter, recommended to no longer be used due to no measurable effectiveness against H1N1 in kids in that season, and then has returned to the recommendations for the 2018-19 season. And in Australia, it's actually the TGA approved registration in 2016 for kids 24 months to 18 years of age. So I guess we'll watch that space eagerly as well. The pictures really do tell a different tale. There's one young girl there who looks to be almost enjoying it, and then there are also some pictures of kids not necessarily enjoying it. So, but I have done some intranasal COVID vaccine studies, and it appears to be a route that's well tolerated. So it would be great if we had an additional option with that. And there's even some work on oral vaccines. This has been a slightly tougher thing to crack, I guess, but Vaxart have been doing some good work in this space for some time. These guys have a platform technology that they make into a tablet form. It's room temperature stable, so another benefit that they call VAST, Vector Adjuvant Antigen Standardized Technology. It's adenovirus vector. Their human challenge study showed it was safe and effective, and their phase 2 study showed some pretty impressive results, 39% reduction in clinical disease compared to placebo, and the comparator was at around 27%. So that looks pretty promising, but still relatively early days, I think. And so I know I've been through all that really quickly, but just to summarise, so we've also got a number of vaccine and therapy options for influenza already, but I think it's clear they're not without limitations, and we'd like to be able to do better. We've got a number of monoclonal antibodies under investigation, with quite a few in phase 2 trials. So hopefully an option there won't be too far away. The precedent with COVID and others, I think, has really helped the cause with those. Recent additions in the vaccine space with augmented vaccines and cell-based vaccines to address egg adaptation have obviously been welcome additions to the arsenal, but still some work to go there. And while I think COVID probably had a slightly negative impact on the development of a lot of these interventions, with everyone pivoting to focusing solely on that virus, I think the gains we've had in some of the technology that we've ended up getting across the line for COVID will hopefully now translate to accelerating some of these developments for the flu. We've got combination vaccines, we've got non-needle and syringe vaccines that will be available fairly soon, and universal vaccine efforts are underway. I'm not sure if we'll ever get there, but at least we've got some promising approaches there, and I think I'm 10 seconds over time. So thank you.
One of the advantages of a universal vaccine is that it prepares us for the next pandemic, if it's influenza. So do you put your money on a universal vaccine, or do you think the new technology will give us rapid turnaround so we'll have a pandemic vaccine out within weeks? Or do we put our money on the universal vaccine, which isn't going to arrive for another 10 years by your predictions?
Oh, look, it's a tricky question. I think what we can say with some certainty is we're in a better position now, seeing what we've seen with the development of the COVID vaccines. And, I think it's clear we'll have a few additional platforms in the not too distant future. Whether we'll ever get a proper universal vaccine that's effective enough to mean we don't need those others, I'm doubtful of that. But as I say, I think we're in a much better position. And, I think there's not going to be any one candidate out of that long list I presented that really solves this. We're going to need a combination of different technologies, like we're seeing with COVID, maybe, intranasal plus intramuscular. We're still going to have a role for monoclonal antibodies, for example. So, I think having a comprehensive approach where we can come at this from a few different angles will be where we get to.
Paul, are we minimising the spectacular decrease in influenza that we saw in the first year of isolation and people taking care of who they hung out with and immunocompromised people staying at home? We're not seeing now, by the way, but in the first 12 months it was spectacular.
Look, obviously that's a very controversial thing in terms of how we speak about how successful that was and what it was that had those impacts. I mean, I think there are valuable lessons to learn there that maybe, in addition to the more traditional things as we've spoken about, there are some approaches we can use to augment what we do, particularly if it's a really bad season. But, I think the amount of opposition we're facing already, if we were to propose doing any of those on a more stringent basis now, I think it would be difficult. So, but I do think there's really valuable lessons that we should take away.
Thank you. Paul and then...
hold it close. Okay. Hi, Paul. Great talk. I have really quite hopeful about improvements in vaccination for older persons. I am not hopeful about improvement for vaccinations for the 6-month to 2-year-olds. And, for a number of reasons, Flumist was never actually licensed for that. I just wonder whether you think there's anything on the horizon. I mean, we do really badly with kids under 1 that get flu, and it's under-recognised. We're having trouble getting them to be vaccinated with something that doesn't work particularly well in that age group. I was hopeful when I saw Vesicari's work about adjuvanted vaccines in children, but it just seems to have gone nowhere. I mean, Canada licensed it but doesn't use it. Is there anything else that may actually help? And just before you answer that, the one thing I think that is possible out of the bits where, and you probably don't realise this being a Queenslander, but we were actually not just locked up, but the community was shut down. No restaurants, no shops or anything else. You had to be a supermarket or a chemist. I think we wasted vaccine that year because we didn't need it but I think one thing that is still possible and does get a bit of work in Victoria but not elsewhere is the whole issue of ventilation, the use of purifiers, making sure there's good airflow and all the rest of it. And I think that's something that will help for flu that probably won't get them marching down the streets of Bourke Street again in Melbourne.
Yeah, thanks. Very good comments, of course. And I'll start with the second one first. I mean, I completely agree. And that's what I kind of mean. There's a lot of lessons to be learnt. And I think there is a bit of a under recognition of some of those points and how we can apply, I guess, longer term. To do with kids, I didn't really see a lot that really said there was any big developments that I could find at least. I couldn't cover everything, but there wasn't a lot that really suggested there was a dramatic improvement in what might be on offer fairly soon. So, you know, I guess some of those other technologies, it remains to be seen how effective they are in kids. And a lot of those trials haven't been done yet. So maybe there will be some of those other platforms that might give us some gains there. But as I say, I didn't see much in that.
Time for one last question.
Well, with your comments about monoclonals, I was just wondering if anyone was looking at those as prophylaxis rather than as treatment, because it seems to me that that might be a more effective way to use those molecules.
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of them, there was laboratory data and animal challenge data for prevention. A lot of the clinical trials were comparing to other treatments. So a lot of the clinical trials were focused more on treatment, but a lot of them were being worked up for prophylaxis, and there was at least animal studies to support that for quite a few of them.
Can I get a follow-up, Paul? Do you really see a role for monoclonal antibodies given their lack of efficacy, their extremely high cost? And to me, they don't do any better than antivirals. In fact, they do worse than antivirals. So what is the clinical role for monoclonals?
Well, I think, you know, if we look at things like Evusheld, there's a proportion of the population that can't respond to vaccination, you know, some 2 to 3% potentially. And, you know, I think if we had an effective, safe, potentially cost-effective intervention to give to those people, you know, we know we're doing more bone marrow transplants, we're giving people more B-cell depleting therapy, for example, and that might allow us to do that a little more freely without having to worry about, you know, influenza in that group. So I do think there is potentially a role. Obviously, you know, it depends on the candidate being successful enough for that. Look, I think antivirals have a role, but I think if you can give something as pre-exposure prophylaxis and prevent that person getting infected, you know, that would be a better strategy. Again, depends on the relative efficacy, cost effectiveness, etc. But if we can crack that with a safe and effective, long-lasting monoclonal to protect that person during that season, I think there would be a role for that. That's true. That's true. I agree.
Paul, is there enough benefit from breastfeeding to, you know, use that as a lateral way of trying to protect neonates?
I think that's really important. And I think there's, you know, that giving flu vaccines as with COVID vaccines is well supported in pregnancy for, you know, a number of reasons. And I think, you know, there's obviously a lot of good work with RSV particularly as well in that space. So yeah, I do think that's a really important thing to consider.
Susie's just given me that message. So, Paul, thank you. Terrific talk.